Preamble. I'll try to keep this brief so there'll be a comment chain with more of my thoughts. I do want to say the following, though. Holy hell, I did not expect such a massive response. I want to thank you all, and I'm happy you all enjoyed this silly little thing I decided to write. As I said in the comments of the previous post, I had two ideas about how it could end. At your guys' request, I have decided to post both versions of the ending. If you like one better than the other, that is the one that happened. The only thing that makes one of them more valid than the other is what you decide for yourself. To keep this from going on too long, I'll save the rest for the comment chain. Version 1. Zerak had to keep himself from panicking as he triple and quadruple checked everything in preparation for the arrival of the Elder. The arrival of an Elder was not something to be taken lightly. Zerak's multiple hearts thudded with anticipation and anxiety. The Elders, ancient and revered among the Crixol, rarely left their homeworlds. Their presence signified that the matter at hand was of utmost importance, and that failure was not an option. If the Elder was displeased with his progress, Zerak wouldn't just lose his position, his very existence could be erased from the annals of Crixol history, a fate worse than death. How could it have gotten to this point? This was supposed to be his crowning achievement. Zerak thought to himself as he could feel the weight of the Elder's impending arrival. The human had become a dangerous enigma. James's defiance was unlike anything the Crixol had encountered in their many conquests. Worse still, if the Crixol had attacked a research outpost and those so-called non-combatants had fought with such tenacity, what would an actual military response from humanity look like? Zerak mentally steeled himself. He didn't have time to worry, and there would be no room for error. The Elder had to see progress, or at least the potential for a breakthrough. How long had he been here by now? Years? James sighed, and he once again pondered the feasibility of an escape. Still not in the slightest. Even if he got to the landing pads, even if he got into one of their ships, even if he figured out how to pilot one of their ships, even if he managed to take off, they would just blow him out of the sky before he could get away. Even if he was valuable, he probably wasn't valuable enough for them to not kill him if he got that far. James briefly considered guerrilla warfare, but since he didn't know much about surviving in the wild and this wasn't his home turf, that idea was a non-starter. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed that security was suddenly being tightened. He hadn't done anything lately to warrant that, so it could only mean one thing: a special visitor. With how often he had been interrogated, he had gotten used to the sudden change in gravitational force as his cell was opened. A large group of guards escorted him from his cell to the interrogation room. Like so many times before, he was chained to the table as he sat and waited, curious if this important guest would be speaking to him personally. The door opened and two guards walked in. It had been a while since any guards were present for these interrogations, so that would probably mean that James's next thoughts were cut off as imposing figure walked into the room. This newcomer was clearly someone of immense importance, taller and more ornately dressed than Zerak, who followed the Elder in, whose posture seemed more submissive than James had ever seen. So, this is the human? His voice, though translated through the same dispassionate technology that James had grown accustomed to, still sounded different somehow. He didn't address James directly, instead speaking to Zerak as if he were some specimen on display. "Yes, Elder," Zerak replied with a deep bow. "He has proven challenging, but we are making progress." The Elder stepped forward, his towering form looming over James. "A research outpost," he mused, his gaze never leaving James's. "And yet these scientists fought as fiercely as any trained warrior. Tell me, human," the Elder finally addressed James directly, "why did your kind choose death over capture? What drives your species to such extremes?" James stared up at the Elder, feeling a mix of dread and defiance well up within him when he suddenly had an idea. As a prisoner, he wasn't valuable enough to stay the soldier's hands if he tried to escape, but this guy just might be. James stared up at the Elder, a flash of defiance sparking behind his eyes as an audacious plan began to form in his mind. This was his chance, probably his only chance. His mind began to race. The lower gravity might work to his advantage here. If he could break those chains quickly enough, he just might have a chance. Not like I've got anything to lose at this point, James thought to himself. The elder's towering form loomed closer, still waiting for an answer, but James's focus was elsewhere. His gaze flickered to the table in front of him, moving it was not beyond his strength. He had felt its weight before, deceptively light due to the lower gravity here. James shifted slightly in his chair, testing the tension in the chains that held him. James did everything he could to buy himself a little more time to prepare. He breathed in deeply, his mind racing to synchronize his movements. The guards that flanked the elder, their hands resting casually on their weapons, were unprepared for what James was about to attempt. He had to make this count. Any hesitation, any mistake, and it would be over in seconds. But if he could get control of the elder... By now, the elder had made his way to James's side of the table, frustrated and annoyed at the lack of a response. James finally looked back up at the elder, his face calm, almost resigned. "You want to know what drives us?" he said, his voice low but steady. The elder leaned in slightly, curiosity piqued. "Survival," James whispered. In one fluid motion, James pushed his feet against the edge of the table with all the force he could muster, simultaneously pulling his arms back. The sudden explosion of force proved too much for the chains as they broke. The table, now no longer being held back by the chains, practically took flight. The guards barely had time to react as the massive slab of metal crashed into them, sending both sprawling to the ground in a heap. James, meanwhile, was sent backwards, though he managed to land on his feet as the room exploded into chaos. Zerak shouted in alarm as James immediately rushed at the elder, the adrenaline surging through his veins. The elder, momentarily stunned by James's audacity, reached for something at his waist, but James was faster. He dove towards the elder, tackling him to the ground before ripping the sidearm the elder had tried to draw from its claw. He had seen that one captain execute a guard with the same type of weapon before. He had seen how it was used. James quickly shot both guards before they could recover from being hit with a flying table, then pressed the weapon against the side of the elder's head. These guys were humanoid enough for James to assume that the brain was probably in the same place, and the dead guards with holes in their heads definitely supported this hypothesis. "Nobody move!" James growled, pressing the weapon harder against the side of the elder's head. More guards entered the room, but froze the moment they saw the elder had been taken hostage, unsure of what to do. They couldn't risk even grazing the elder, but they also couldn't be the ones who let some primitive creature harm the elder. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place, and James was counting on it. Using the elder as a meat shield, James made his way to the landing pads, moving with calculated precision to not expose himself in a manner that allow any of the guards to shoot without the elder being collateral damage. His adrenaline was pumping, but he forced himself to remain calm and focused. The guards stared at him, weapons drawn but held at bay by the threat to their leader. They wouldn't risk the elder's life. They couldn't. "Open the doors to the landing pad," James commanded, keeping his voice steady as he tightened his grip on the elder. The elder flinched slightly, but wouldn't give the order directly. Pride wouldn't allow it. Zerak, trailing behind and watching the scene with growing horror, finally found his voice. "Do as he says!" he barked at the guards. "Open the doors!" The guards hesitated but followed the order. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the landing pad and a sleek yet ornate Crixall shuttle, its engines idling in readiness. "That's probably how the elder got here," James thought as he backed out onto the pad and into the shuttle while keeping the elder in front of him. His plan was risky. There were millions of ways this could go wrong, but he couldn't back out now. Worst-case scenario, he could at least take this elder down with him. Once inside the shuttle, James sealed the doors and turned to the pilot, who was looking with a stunned and terrified expression. Seeing one of the elders being held hostage, the pilot froze until a scream of pain woke him from his stupor. What he saw horrified the pilot even more. One of the elder's eyes had been gouged out, and the human's hand was stained with green blood. "Now you're going to jump this craft to human space, or I will paint the inside of this craft with your elder's blood," James shouted. The pilot quickly got back in his seat and piloted the craft out of the planet's atmosphere, claws trembling as he configured the FTL drive. He glanced over to the elder, only to see him still held at gunpoint. The pilot hesitated for only a moment longer as he engaged the FTL drive. Captain Xander Hale looked around the bridge of his ship as they patrolled the system. Ever since the mysterious destruction of the Elysium Vortex research colony 2 years ago, patrols and security operations had intensified massively. Not that it really mattered. There wasn't anything out here other than a few automated mining stations. Suddenly, his communications officer cried out that they were receiving a signal that the system had defined to be of alien origin. Strangely, however, the signal was in perfect English. SOS, we surrender. SOS, we surrender. The captain called all hands on deck and weapons ready before instructing his communications officer to attempt to contact the alien ship. A video connection was established, and what he saw caught him completely off guard. He was expecting a weird-looking alien or two, but not for one of them to be held at what appeared to be gunpoint by a human. He thought for a few moments. "I am Captain Xander Hale of the Galactic Commonwealth of Humanity. Identify yourselves and state your intentions." The human smiled and responded. "My name is Jochemjong. I am a survivor from the alien attack on the Elysium Vortex research colony. I was taken captive to be studied but have managed to escape by taking a high-value hostage. I request immediate aid." Captain Hale looked at the screen, dumbfounded as his mind raced with questions. Ultimately, though, he pushed his questions to the back of his mind. For as far as he could tell, there was a human putting out a distress call. Protocol was very clear on this matter. "We are coming over to retrieve you and your friends. Hold your position and await any further instructions." The past few days had been a whirlwind of tension. After being picked up by a patrol, James was immediately subjected to a barrage of medical tests, each one more invasive than the last. They needed to confirm his identity. They needed to make sure he didn't carry some alien disease, and there were probably countless other things they tested for, though he didn't particularly care. Once they finally established who he really was, he was assigned personal quarters. Later that same day, he was called into a room full military and government officials about his capture and captivity. The sterile conference room felt suffocating as he recounted the harrowing details of his experiences, his captivity, the isolation, the fear. They listened intently, taking notes and asking questions, seeking every scrap of information he could provide. "It started when all our FTL communications suddenly went down," James explained again. "Investigation quickly showed that the satellites had been destroyed. The alarm was immediately sounded, but before long, we detected numerous non-human spacecraft entering the atmosphere and making directly for the colony. They attacked immediately, and everything turned to chaos from that point on." An older woman spoke up, her voice firm but entirely free of malice or judgment. "Were you the only survivor?" James sighed deeply before answering. He was running on fumes at this point. "I believe so. During the attack, an explosion knocked me out for a bit. When I came to, everyone around me was dead, and I was quickly subdued. The Crixol never said I wasn't the only survivor, but I'm not sure how reliable that is." A man spoke up. "About their communication with you. Can you tell us more about their translation efforts? You said you delayed them for some time?" James chuckled softly. He was still rather proud of that one, and even now he could see the humor of it. "In short, I'm fluent in Dutch and English, speak a little French and German, and know a few isolated words or phrases in Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese. At the colony, we mostly spoke English with each other. The first time the researcher approached my cell, he had a device that translated his words to English, I'm guessing because they had studied us from a distance before attacking. Digital communications were all in English, so that's probably what they used if I had to guess. I responded in Dutch to see if they had accounted for multiple languages, and it turned out they had not." James smiled as he remembered Zerak's growing annoyance and exasperation. "Every time he came over, I used a different language, starting with the ones I was most familiar with and going down the list until I had run out of languages. They may be operating under the belief that they can now perfectly translate all the languages I mentioned, but the only ones I can confirm that they can actually translate are English and Dutch." Seeing James's exhaustion, an older man who had introduced himself as General Parker spoke next. "Thank you, James. You have given us a lot to consider. We will likely have more questions and thus more meetings in the future, but for now we'll let you get some rest. Naturally, everything you've heard and said here is to be considered top secret, and is not to be discussed or mentioned outside of these four walls. Understood? Of course, General, James responded, not like he had any desire to talk about this stuff to other people. In fact, all he desired at this point was rest. He had spent so long constantly on edge, and now that he was free, his exhaustion finally began to hit him. Finally free, and yet I think I have been interrogated more in the last 2 weeks than I was during my captivity, James joked to himself as he set his lunch down on the table in his chambers. He could go and eat in the mess hall, be among others, but for now he just wanted to be alone. The fact that he could choose to be alone was already more than he had dared to hope for. The past 2 weeks had been a constant barrage of meetings and tests, both medical and psychological, though at times the latter felt a lot like those meetings as he was forced to recount what he had gone through over and over again. At least the seat was more comfortable there. He had since learned he was a captive for 2 years, so his first shower felt like a gift from heaven. His first meal that wasn't a bland, tasteless nutrient paste tasted better than anything he had ever eaten before. It was also rather nice to have an actual private bathroom that wasn't just a toilet in the middle of a nearly featureless cell. James pondered his situation as he enjoyed his lunch, remembering something the psychologist said to him about how it would take time for him to adjust to having the ability to choose again. During those meetings, he sometimes felt himself falling back into the same mindset he had been in for the past 2 years, seeing nothing but enemies around him. He knew he wasn't in danger, but some part of him refused to accept it, and he began to fear it never would. As he finished his lunch, James heard faintly familiar footsteps approaching his door, though he didn't know why he recognized them. They didn't sound like any of the military personnel he had interacted with. Their steps were more measured than the ones he heard approaching. Part of James's mind immediately began preparing for the worst. When the door opened, his mother stepped in first, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. "James!" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper, yet somehow also a scream of elation. She rushed towards him and enveloped him in a fierce hug, her warmth and familiarity overwhelming him. James wrapped his arms around her, squeezing tightly as if he feared she might vanish. "I thought we lost you," she murmured, her voice trembling as she pulled back to look at him, examining every detail of his face as though reassuring herself he was really there. James wanted to speak, to say anything, but he couldn't. For 2 years he hadn't allowed himself to feel anything. For 2 years he hid himself behind a mask of confident indifference. It was in this moment that the mask finally shattered. He barely even noticed when his father joined in on the embrace, as well as his brother and sister. After what might as well have been another 2 years, even the group hug had to come to an end. James looked around, wanting to say so much, yet not having the words to say anything, and began to cry as for the first time in 2 years, he was truly happy. Version 2. Zerak had to keep himself from panicking as he triple and quadruple checked everything in preparation for the arrival of the Elder. The arrival of an Elder was not something to be taken lightly. Zerak's multiple hearts thudded with anticipation and anxiety. The Elders, ancient and revered among the Crixall, rarely left their homeworlds. Their presence signified that the matter at hand was of utmost importance, and that failure was not an option. If the Elder was displeased with his progress, Zerak wouldn't just lose his position. His very existence could be erased from the annals of Crixall history, a fate worse than death. Zerak could feel the weight of the Elder's impending arrival. The human had become a dangerous enigma. James's defiance was unlike anything the Crixall had encountered in their many conquests. Worse still, if the Crixall had attacked a research outpost and those so-called non-combatants had fought with such tenacity, what would an actual military response from humanity look like? Zerak mentally steeled himself. He didn't have time to worry, and there would be no room for error. The Elder had to see progress, or at least the potential for a breakthrough. How long had he been here at this point? Years. James sighed and once again pondered the feasibility of an escape, still not in the slightest. Even if he got to the landing pads, even if he got into one of their ships, even if he figured out how to pilot one of their ships, even if he managed to take off, They would just blow him out of the sky before he could get away. Even if he was valuable, he wasn't valuable enough for them to not kill him if he got that far, and even if he was, not like he knew how to get back to human space. No, escape was not an option. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed that security was suddenly being tightened. He hadn't done anything to warrant that, so it could only mean one thing. A special visitor. With how often he had been interrogated, he had gotten used to the sudden change in gravitational force as his cell was opened. A large group of guards escorted him from his cell to the interrogation room. Like so many times before, he was chained to the table as he sat and waited, curious if this important guest would be speaking to him personally. The door opened and 2 guards walked in. It had been a while since any guards were present for these interrogations, so that would probably mean that James's next thoughts were cut off as imposing figure walked into the room. This newcomer was clearly someone of immense importance, taller and more ornate than Zerak, who followed the elder in, his posture more submissive than James had ever seen. So, this is the human. His voice translated through the same dispassionate technology that James had grown accustomed to. He didn't address James directly, instead speaking to Zerak as if he were some specimen on display. "Yes, Elder," Zerak replied with a deep bow. "He has proven challenging, but we are making progress." The elder stepped forward, his towering form looming over James. "A research outpost," he mused, his gaze never leaving James's. "And yet these scientists fought as fiercely as any trained warrior. Tell me, human," the elder finally addressed James directly, "why did your kind choose death over capture? What drives your species to such extremes?" James stared up at the elder, feeling a mix of dread and defiance well up within him as he made his peace with his fate. He had wanted vengeance for his friends for all this time, but being a nuisance would never satisfy this. If this newcomer was as important as he seemed, this might be his chance. James stared up at the elder, a flash of defiance sparking behind his eyes. This was his chance, his only chance. He had felt the lower gravity in this room before, and while the Crixol saw their heavy metal tables and chains as unbreakable, James knew they were underestimating him, as they had from the start. He had been testing his strength for months, working out in his cell. He was ready. It was time to make them pay. The elder's towering form loomed closer, still waiting for an answer, but James's focus elsewhere. His gaze flickered to the heavy table in front of him. In normal Earth gravity, it might be too heavy, but not here. James leaned back a bit, pretending to put one of his feet on his seat. He breathed in deeply, his mind racing to synchronize his movements. The guards flanked the elder, their hands resting casually on their weapons, unprepared for what James was about to attempt. He had to make this count. Any hesitation, any mistake, and it would be over in seconds. James looked back up at the elder, his face calm, almost resigned. This would either work or it would not. Either way, he was going to die. "You want to know what drives me?" he said, his voice low but steady. The elder leaned in slightly, curiosity piqued. "Revenge," James whispered. In one fluid motion, James kicked his feet against the edge of the table and pushed with all his might, simultaneously pulling his arms back. The sudden explosion of force quickly proved too much for the chains, and they shattered. The table, now freed from the chain that was holding it back, was sent flying at the guards. The guards barely had time to react as the massive slab of metal crashed into them, sending both sprawling to the ground in a heap. The room exploded into chaos. Zerak shouted in alarm as James immediately tackled the elder to the ground and grabbed onto the elder's head, slamming it into the ground and killing him instantly. As the guards began to recover, James leapt towards them, the lower gravity combined with the adrenaline allowing him to move quicker than ever before. The guards were still on the ground, pinned between the table and the wall. James landed on the table before kicking one of the guards in the head, his neck snapping instantly with a sickening crunch. The other guard froze in shock, which was all the time James needed to pull off his helmet and cave his skull in with a single kick. Zerak could do nothing but look on in horror, his eyes still locked on the lifeless body of the elder when he suddenly felt an immense pain in his legs and fell to the ground. James stood over him, holding a stun baton he had taken from the guards. As James went back to the dead guards, taking one of their laser pistols, seemingly the same kind he had seen one of his guards being executed with once, as well as a nanoblade. He tested the balance of both the knife and the pistol. He would have to make do. James looked at Zerak, laying on the ground with 2 broken legs, and still shocked at what had happened. James grabbed Zerak's radio before pinning him against the wall. "You and your people killed my friends. Did you really think I would let that slide?" James pulled his knife but stopped himself, tossing Zerak to the ground right next to the elder's lifeless body. He would have to leave at least one terrified survivor if he wanted to have maximum effect. Death would probably be a mercy for him anyway, James reasoned. Using the translator the Zerak had implanted into him, James finally stopped hiding his anger as he spoke into the radio. "Your elder is dead, and I killed him!" James stepped out of the interrogation chamber as alarms were sounded throughout the entire facility. He fought without fear or sense of self-preservation. He was going to die here, and he would drag as many down with him as he could. During the elder's visit, the human managed to escape and kill the elder. Using weapons taken from slain guards, the human fought his way through the facility, eventually finding the central reactor. The human destroyed the reactor. The resulting explosion caused a chain reaction, which ultimately led to the destruction of a large part of the complex, with significant damage to the rest, as well as the surrounding districts. Considering the extreme risk of enslaving or exterminating humans, I strongly recommend leaving them alone. An excerpt from the final report of head xenopsychology researcher Zerak, who has since been executed for treason. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.